All of our students who are here as part of your course, please make sure that you sign in over there with Ali. Make sure you sign in for the course as well. We'll get started in just a minute, folks. What I am curious about is to know, of all the places you could be today, what is exciting to you about this conversation? What brings you here?
Learn something new.
Learning something new. Thank you. About finance. Okay, what else? Of all the places you could be today, what brought you here?
Fascinated about money and psychology of money.
Thank you.
So I work as a financial planner, and I'm always looking to gain more insight on how to engage with clients because they're always changing their minds and have different opinions and whatnot. So always looking to get a good nugget.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's why we called it Mind Over Money, because anyone who's been in the field for a little bit knows that you can create the perfect financial plan and it becomes a document that doesn't do much else. Yes.
To hear advice and experiences from real world practitioners.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, I can promise you we'll deliver that.
To create a new mindset when it comes to making and investing money.
Okay, thinking about that for yourself, creating your own mindset around making and investing. Yes. Give me one more. One more. I haven't heard from any of the sisters in the room. Yes. Thank you.
I feel like we can always learn no matter how much experience we have. So the experienced panelists brought me in today.
Ah, lovely. Thank you. And the reason that I brought that up is so often, historically, financial conversations have centered on men. And many financial planners now actually specialize in working with women for that very reason. So you're going to hear from two of my very favorite humans. I'm Sandra Davis. I am a graduate of the master's degree in financial planning program here at Golden Gate way back in 2006. I was a 40-year-old intern way before Robert De Niro. I did this as a career change in my 40s, having no experience, no knowledge whatsoever of personal finance. And I was 44, and I knew I was not going to have enough money to retire, and I was panicking a little bit. And so my partner said, "Why don't you become a financial planner?" And I literally had never heard that term before. I never knew those words. And I went to a bookstore back in the days where you could walk into a bookstore, and I read a book. The author shall remain nameless. And the author said, if you're going to hire a financial planner, hire a CFP, or better yet, someone with a master's degree in financial planning. So I got on the computer and I found a master's degree in financial planning, and lo and behold, it was right here at my alma mater for my undergrad. So I came back to Golden Gate and did that in my 40s. One of the very first people to embrace me in the field and mentor me was Dr. Dave Yeske. And that's who is sitting with me here today. And in addition to creating a pathway for me to build my own expertise and be the expert that I am now in the field, and now the program director of the program, he's also just been a trailblazer in this notion of life planning, and he'll talk more about that. But I'm going to ask each one of my panelists to introduce what they want you to know about them. I've told you what I wanted you to know. And then Tom is our program director for the psychology department here in the Agino School of Business. And what I appreciate so much, and the reason I wanted Tom to join us for this panel, was so you all could hear from a psychologist's perspective, both a practitioner and an academic, about how these topics show up. How do they show up in professionals, helping professions, and then how do they show up in their work with their clients? So I'm Sandra Davis. I'm going to be your friendly moderator today, And I'm going to pass it to Dr. Yeski to tell you what he wants you to know about him. And then Dr. Woolridge will do the same.
I guess one of the things I'd like you to know is that I've just felt really gratified to be able. First of all, I realized the other day that I've been practicing financial planning longer than the profession existed at the time that I started, which I'm not quite sure how to think about that. I'm still contemplating what it means. But early on, I'm going to say early in my career, back in the 90s, I can remember having people start to talk about this thing called life planning. And Dick Wagner was one of my great mentors in this field, and George Kinder was another one. And at the time, it suddenly was causing light bulbs to go off over everyone's head. It's like, well, yeah, let's talk about this. Let's make it a formal conversation. And I had a few pioneers from the profession who'd been around back in 1970 when we really got rolling, and who didn't like those conversations. And I said, why? They said, well, I've been doing that all along. And it's like, well, yes, to be a good advisor, you have to have some at least intuitive understanding of human psychology and human behavior in order to be able to uncover what matters to people and help develop recommendations they'll actually act on. But what was happening in the 90s was it was surfacing as a formal conversation within the profession. And flash forward to not that many years ago, 3, 4, 5 years ago, CFP Board actually made the psychology of financial planning one of the formal knowledge domains that you had to they had to be both taught and tested on in order to become a certified financial planner. And so I've been able to see this progress, and it's been in some ways inevitable, because as financial planners, we are advising human beings, and human beings have this, humanness to them that we have to be able to account for if we're actually going to effectively advise them. So I guess that's the long answer to the short question, but that's kind of the thing I come in here with, is this, having watched it start from something that was intuitive to something that was being talked about to something that became formalized in our actual licensing process. And who knows where we go from here, but the one thing I know for sure is that we're better, more effective advisors the more deeply we understand the human psyche and human behavior.
Thank you. Dr. Woolridge.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Tom Woolridge. I'm the chair of the psychology department, and I'm also a psychotherapist and psychoanalyst in private practice. It's kind of an odd thing to have a psychology department in a business school. It's not something you see very often. Psychology deals with, I'd say, different things, but one thing it deals with is the emotional meaning that we attach to different things, including money. And so there's a really cool synergy here, I think, between what Sandra and Dave are doing and what we do in psychotherapy and counseling psychology, which is we look at the emotional meaning of things for individuals. And I hope that'll get unpacked today. At least that's the contribution I'm hoping to make, is how do we think about the meaning of money for the given person in front of us, because there can be quite a bit of variability. So I'm hoping that's the lens I can bring to the discussion today, and that it'll be useful.
Thank you both. What's exciting for me about this conversation is that even with a master's degree in financial planning, I very early learned, and Dave, you know this from being there when I was going through this, I very early in my career change learned that my information, my knowledge, having a master's degree in financial planning, did nothing to change the people who I was trying to impact. I really wanted to work with people who were low and moderate income. Some people might call the working poor. And what I realized was me going out and spewing the tax code did not help them do anything differently with their money. Not only did it not help them, in many cases, I was still making some of the same financial mistakes that I was making before I got the master's. And so, as you all know, I have some questions here. I'm going to ask you the questions, answer them to the degree you want, and then say whatever the heck you want to say about the topic. So we're gonna reach way back. How many of you, before I ask this question, how many of you can identify one thing about what you do with money today that you know comes from a childhood message, behavior, or belief? How many of you know there's at least one thing you do, whether it's not throwing away anything, reusing the aluminum foil, whatever it is, everybody that has at least one thing. What's
Or
one?
maybe a counter reaction to something that you grew up with?
Right, or yes.
One thing that I
Closer.
The one thing that I continue to do to this day that I used to do as a child is save all of my pocket change.
Okay, saving the pocket change. Give me one more. What's one thing that you know?
So my dad always thought that it's better eating at home than spending money eating out. So like somehow it gotta happen for me. And like I rarely eat out. I always prepare food at home.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. And also, I know there's a lot of you out in Zoom. We appreciate you all being here, and we want you to feel connected to the conversation. Please feel free to put any questions or comments that you have in the chat, and the amazing team here at Golden Gate will get those messages to me, and we'll respond to those as well. So the first question, gentlemen, is how do early childhood experiences influence our financial behavior in adulthood? How do our early experiences influence today? Tom, you want to take a run at that first?
Sure. Yeah, I can make an attempt. So the thing I'd say there is that I think early childhood, from a psychodynamic or psychological point of view, early childhood shapes personality, right? I think we know this more and more from empirical and theoretical research. The first 6 years in particular are really important for things like attachment style. How safe do we feel with other people? Do we feel we can rely on other people? Can we count on them to be there for us? But even past the 6th year, into adolescence, late childhood, still very formative in how we relate to the social environment, how we consolidate a sense of identity. So by the time we get to 18, 20, we have a more or less consolidated personality style that can change, but change within limits. It's plastic, but within limits, right? And why is this important? Because I think our personality style shapes what money means to us. So let me just give some examples. If I think of patients I've worked with over the years, for some people, money becomes associated with a sense of independence, right? If I have money, then I don't have to depend on anybody. That would be a more pathological or problematic form. But it could also be, less extreme. Just, if I have money, I can do the things I want to do with my life. But that's the meaning of money for that person, right? For another person, money might become really associated with self-worth and self-esteem. If I have access to money, then it means I've somehow made it. Or it can even be equated with, goodness, the goodness of myself. So that's the kind of meaning of money as it unfolds in the context of the personality. And then the thing I want to highlight in addition is that intersects with structural factors, right? And what do I mean by structural factors? Things like poverty, things like deprivation that children may experience, the different identities we hold and how that shapes our access to things, education, food, all the different sort of social classes have a different experience of money growing up. And that also has a kind of residue that carries over into adolescence and adulthood and, is a part of the personality structure that develops. Those are the thoughts off the top of my head.
Thank you. Dave, where you at?
Well, and I think that's totally congruent with the view of any practicing financial planner as well as financial planning researchers. The same phenomena have been witnessed in our field as well, that people, they walk into your office and they have often unexamined views of money, of the role money plays in their lives. I mean, Dick Wagner talks about, used to talk about, we sadly lost him a few years ago, but he used to talk about the fact that financial planning should really be a liberal arts profession, because the notion of money and people's relationship to money permeates all aspects of society. There's always, in every movie you see, every play you see, every book you read, somewhere in there's a money character. There may be several. Sometimes that money character looms large and sometimes it's smaller, but it's always there. And this goes back to the beginning of time. I mean, human beings have been obsessed about money for as long as money has existed. Dick used to like to say that money is mentioned more times in the Bible than God. And the reason is pretty straightforward. Money is the medium through which we human beings interact with the material world. It would be a miracle if it didn't loom large in our lives in all of its aspects. And so sometimes it becomes dysfunctional. People have trouble managing their lives or their happiness. And obviously a professional consulting or a professional therapist is where they're going to get help. And sometimes they're just at odds with how to manage the money forces in their lives. And so, this is where there's obviously a lot of overlap, but where financial planners are trying to deal with the more practical dimension. But I know this was a question about childhood, money attitudes formed in childhood, and we will actually ask clients, what did you learn about money from your mother? And what did you learn about money from your father? And you give them an opportunity to talk about these formative experiences. And what the interesting thing for me is that I've never had anyone who couldn't answer that question. Almost all of them instantly. Money meant ... to your mother, and it's like, boom, they answer. And likewise for their father. And what often happens is that they see things from a different perspective. And it opens up new opportunities for us to help them manage the money forces in their life to attain their goals. But it's interesting how unexamined, I don't know if you use that word, but how unexamined these forces often are, except for someone maybe who's been in psychotherapy or been with a financial planner who took them there. But it becomes part of the skill set ultimately, is to have this sufficient self-awareness about where your attitudes towards money came from. And it doesn't mean that, as Tom says, they can change, at least maybe within a range. But it permeates everything. That's the thing that I come back to again and again.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that I ask people in groups like this and in any setting that I'm in is for someone to name for me one aspect of your life, the Zoom crowd as well. Tell me one aspect that money doesn't touch. What is something that money has nothing to do with? Anything at all. And there you have it. There is no aspect of our lives that money doesn't touch. Fulya, we've got one comment.
Well, the first thing that came to mind was my love for my children, which is irrelevant to money.
And
what I can do for them is very relevant to
that
money.
part. But let me ask you this. How might, if you experienced multi-generational not enough to provide for your children, how might that be different in how you parent your children?
Absolutely.
So usually someone will say my spiritual practice, and then my question to them is, if you were unable to provide for your daily living, how much time would you have to focus on your spiritual life or your spiritual pathways? And so it's not to say it's all about money. It's to say that money touches everything, and we get to decide. To today's point, we get to decide how much examination we do, and that's really the invitation that we offer for you all here today. It's how do you examine what it means to you? I often say, and Tom, I'd like for you to chime in about this. Right now, if you were to Google financial trauma, it pops up everywhere. If you had done that 5-10 years ago, you never would have heard that term. Now, one of my favorite definitions of trauma came from Dr. Ted Klontz, who developed in partnership with his son money scripts of what do we believe and what are our behaviors around money. And Ted said to me in my own conversation with him, he said, trauma is what happens when something that should have happened didn't, or something that should not have happened did. And so now we're in this time period where financial trauma is a conversation, right? And I would contend, and Tom, rescue me if I'm wrong, I would contend there are financial things that happen. There are financial aspects of life that happens. Like I was a homeless teenager, right? So I have some financial behaviors that I can directly attribute to that point. at that point in time. And then there are some things that happened that were impactful for me and traumatic that have financial implications. So the trauma itself wasn't financial, but it has implications for what I do and what I believe about money. And so I'm curious, when you think about conversations that therapists have about trauma, how often do you see it show up where it is either created by a financial event or it has financial implications, that it's some other event and it has financial implications? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I don't know if this exactly gets to your question, but the thing that comes up for me is that there is a distinction between internal conflict and trauma. And I think, it's an important distinction. Somebody can have internal conflict that's unexamined. And so when they come into a therapist's office or a financial planner's office and you ask them a question like, what ideas did your mother and father hold about money? This is an invitation for them to examine these previously unconscious attitudes they might have had about money. So I'll give you an example. Your point about your love for your children really brought this up for me. I have a 10-year-old, and just the other day he said, "Dad, I'd really like to have an allowance." And oh gosh, all right. So I'll give you an allowance. And so my first thought was, well, do I just give it to him every week, or do I ask him to do some chores, right? And he's a really conscientious kid, and he's busy, and I don't really want to give him chores. So, I just agreed to give him whatever amount of money every week. And my first thought that evening was, well, what am I teaching him about money if I just give him the money with no chores? Right there, I'm into my own internal conflict, right? But it's not connected in that example to a trauma, so I can think about it. But other people, right, they've had traumatic experiences, or, we've all had traumatic experiences. And the way I would define trauma is that it's something that we can't think about and process on our own, right? When we're traumatized, we need the help of another person because the emotional impact is too much for us to hold in our own minds, right? So when we're traumatized, we really need to be with another person, to talk with another person, so that together that emotion can start to be kind of worked through and processed, right? And I think you can have trauma directly in relation to money. You can grow up in poverty or in homelessness, or you can have, seemingly unrelated experiences. Like, let's say you grew up with a certain kind of emotional deprivation, right? You had plenty of money, maybe you were even wealthy, but you didn't really feel cared for and loved. But then over time, money comes to mean access to care and love for you. If I have money, then I'm going to be romantically desirable, for example. So it becomes a kind of proxy for the thing that you were deprived of earlier. The trauma's not directly in the sphere of money, but it takes on that meaning. So that can happen too.
Thank you. Dave, when you think about this in the context of the work that you do and how many of us you have trained in residency and in your reign here as the program director, say a little bit about how you navigate, how a professional would navigate this with clients. I mean, we've all heard financial planners who say, "Oh, I feel like a therapist." Yeah, but you're not. Okay? You might feel like a therapist. You might be asking questions that sound therapeutic, and you are not. So how do you suggest when people either on their own, as many of these folks will go home and they might examine some of the things that we've talked about today, but when you're working with someone, specifically a financial professional, what do you want financial professionals to do and not do when having these kinds of conversations with clients?
Well, so first of all, trauma was a really great example because we don't treat trauma as financial planners. We're not trained for it. It creates an interesting, just a side note, when I was starting out, whatever it was now, 35, 36 years ago, 38 years ago, training to be a financial planner, everyone was obsessed with, making sure you don't practice law without a license. And now we're living in a world where everyone's like, don't forget, you're not a therapist. But we deal with so many of the same forces because we're both dealing with human beings. So when I'm talking to a professional financial planner or wannabe financial planner, I emphasize the fact that having an understanding of not just human behavior in general, but how it maps onto the given individual you're trying to advise becomes an essential part of the process, a necessary part of the process. It's why it arose in our profession inevitably. You couldn't keep it out to the point where, again, CFP board acknowledged it as, or created a new knowledge domain around it. It's because human beings have been shown to act on things where you're connecting the dots for them. And if you don't understand them, if you don't have some insights into what their background is, how they were raised, how money, what money scripts that they may have developed as they were growing up, you don't really know how to give them advice that they can hear. So yeah, we're not there to solve their trauma, but we're there to understand them deeply enough that we can deliver our advice in a way they can hear and internalize and therefore act upon. So we're here to help people not solve their trauma, not work out the demons that they have from their mother, their father, or anyone else, but to be able to hear what we think is the best path forward for them based on what we know about their values, their priorities, and how they hear and process information. And so this is the overlap, and I probably have drifted off the point of your question, but I think it's one of the inevitabilities of psychology becoming a fundamental dimension of financial planning. If we're going, again, as I've said earlier, if we're going to be good advisors, if we're going to be effective advisors.
Yeah, actually that was exactly what I was going for, because what I'm hoping that we are starting here and what we're building here is this larger community of people, the general public, the folks who come to hang out with us here, whether you're a student or whether you come for these types of events, that we can talk about these kinds of topics. And the reason that is so important to me is that we hear all the time, people don't want to talk about money. Money is taboo. How many of you heard that? Money is taboo. How many of you have even said it, right? We don't want to talk about money. I would contend everyone wants to talk about money. They just need a safe place to do so. And the reason that I was so excited about getting the two of you together was so that we can really kind of unpack that, because I've been, most of you, those of you who've worked with me before or been around me at all, know most of my work is with low and moderate income clients. I've been in situations where you can have two people born in the same household hearing the same messages from their parents. And that message might be, we can't afford it, we can't afford it, we can't afford it, we can't afford it. I see some nods, right? So we can't afford it. You can have one of those two people who say, I'll never live like that again, and save every dime. And the other one say, I'll never live like that again, and spend every dime. And so when we think about that dynamic, when we think about how the same message, even out in our society, right? When we look at where things are right now, and the fear that some people are having around the economy, the market, when things are going well and when they're not, each individual has their way of processing that information. And so how does either a therapist or a financial planner invite people into that self-reflection or that examined life in a way that is safe for them, if they're working with someone or if they're not? How can people who are just everyday folks who are experiencing financial trauma or financial distress or job loss or any of the things that are going on, whether it's possibilities or problems, right? I've got a job opportunity. How do I decide? I've just lost my job. Do I go out on my own? How do people navigate all of the money stuff in uncertainty? And I would contend there's always uncertainty. So some people say, well, what do you do in uncertain times? Tell me a time that's not uncertain. So I know I asked a protracted question. Do I need to synthesize it? All right, hit it. Let's hear. Tom, why don't you start us?
Sure, yeah. Well, I think I just first want to acknowledge that we live in a world where many people are put into situations that just are intolerable, right? And so the idea that we're going to be able to help everybody get within the window of what they can tolerate and reflect on, if they're in certain structural or socioeconomic conditions, that may not be possible, right? So if people are homeless, for example, if they're struggling to, get enough to eat every day, it's probably not going to be today's task to help them get to a place where they feel comfortable enough to reflect. Their concrete circumstances really have to be addressed. So that just, I want to acknowledge that. That said, though, I think your example was a lovely one, right? Somebody can grow up in a family where there's a kind of refrain, we don't have enough, we don't have enough, we don't have enough. And a person can grow up and identify with that idea, and then as they grow up into adulthood, they're repeating that same message, I don't have enough, I don't have enough, I don't have enough. Or they can rebel against it and go in the opposite direction, right? They impulsively spend as a defense against that feeling of, the underlying feeling of deprivation, right? So you've got an identification and you've got a defense. And the challenge is always to get to the feeling underneath. There's some underlying feeling, a feeling of deprivation, which, you know, for the child hearing that message, probably was scary. It probably was a lot to take in. And the feeling is always associated with anxiety. And so I think when we're having a conversation with somebody, part of what we're doing is we're tracking their level of anxiety. And we're adapting our pacing to match what they can tolerate. In psychology, there's this idea of a window of tolerance. It's a kind of window, and if you go above it, you're into too much anxiety and your reflection shuts down. If you're below it, you start to zone out and disappear. So you have to keep somebody's anxiety in that window of tolerance. You want them to be a little anxious because that's a sign that you're getting close to the feeling. But you don't want to get so anxious that your ability to think shuts down.
So Tom, when someone is noticing that, so if I'm noticing that for myself, just in my own life, right, and I maybe don't have a therapist or I don't have someone that I feel is knowledgeable or a safe place for me to talk about it, what kind of things can I do for me if I'm noticing that I'm not opening my bills because I know that I don't want to see what's in there? Or I'm the person in my family that everybody goes to when they're having financial troubles, and I don't know how to give myself some space around it. What are some of the things that an individual person can do when they're having experiences that are testing the window of tolerance, right? Maybe bumping up against my boundary, and what can I do for me when I'm experiencing something like that?
Yeah, so there are fundamentally two different types of emotional regulation, right? And the first is self-regulation. So there are things that you can do to help your own organism regulate itself. Things like exercise, deep breathing, grounding yourself in your senses. You know, notice 3 things in the room. You know, there's a podium, there's a table, there's a chair. Bringing yourself sort of back into your concrete reality, because usually when people are dysregulated, they're spinning out into a kind of narrative. You know, letting your breathing, you know, deepen and slow down. These are different forms of self-regulation, right? I mean, there's so many different ways you can regulate yourself. But the other kind of self-regulation is called co-regulation. And that's where you really use another person to bring yourself back to emotional balance, right? You see this with kids all the time, right? You know, kid skins his knee on the playground, he runs and finds a teacher or a parent, he says, oh, you know, I'm so upset. They have a conversation, and by the end of the conversation, you know, the kid is calm again. The kid can go and get a Band-Aid and, you know, clean it and feel better. That's co-regulation, right? And I think we live in a culture and a society that prioritizes self-regulation over co-regulation. And self-regulation is important, right? I mean, I get up every morning and I do stuff, you know, breathing to kind of help me start the day on the right foot. But I think the reality is that you'll reach the limit of that if you're upset enough, and you do need another person.
Bringing this back to what you could do as a professional financial planner, as a practicing financial planner, I think that at the end of the day, you've got to do your own work. You know, you can only go as deep with a client as you've gone with yourself. And in the capstone class that I teach with Elisa Bowie, one of the things that we do early on, in fact, they're going through it this week, is we have them go through a whole series of exercises for themselves, with themselves. And we happen to be using, in this instance, we use a bunch of tools from a company called Money Quotient. Sandra knows about probably 100 other variations on that. They're out there. Yeah, there are lots of tools out there. But what we have found is that the students start answering these questions and reflecting on these questions for themselves. And they are not required to share anything. They're required to complete these these instruments and turn them in, as instructors, we don't share them with the rest of the class. We have a discussion forum where they can show up and discuss whatever insights they gained. And they're not required to, though, because these things can be very powerful and very personal. What I find interesting is the absolute openness with which everyone shows up, sharing some of the rawest experiences that they've come to realize, formed their attitudes about money and the world and relationships and all the rest. And I think that in addition to beginning that, you've got to do your reps. You got to get your 10,000 hours in. And so once you've started to gain insights into how you can show up better, and those insights begin with understanding what's going on inside of you, what your own sort of motivations in history are. First of all, I think that increases your reservoir of compassion for the people sitting across the conference table from you. If you've done your own work, you can have compassion for the foibles of every other human being you're advising. But you got to get your reps in. You've got to actually practice. And a lot of that, honestly, is best done as role play in the early days, as far as I'm concerned. But spend time in some of these self-regulation practices for yourself. Sit quietly before you go into a client meeting. Breathe deeply, quiet your mind, contemplate what you're bringing to that meeting, and then be open and compassionate with your clients. I had a student who was also ended up being an intern at our firm, and she was in the practicum, which we were talking about earlier, where they're working with real life human beings. And I pulled her into a meeting one day, a discovery meeting with a new client. And I asked the client one open-ended question, and she talked for an hour and a half. And we listened. And we were present. We listened actively. We were very present and encouraging in that quiet, active way you can, and that could be trained. And at the end of that meeting, we'd learned everything we needed to learn for the moment. And the client left, and the student/intern turned to me and said, "My partner and I are doing our interview tonight. We had developed 80 questions." And I'm like, you won't need 80 questions. If you just show up interested, walk into that room or join that Zoom meeting, whatever form it's taking, and be curious. Show up curious. And you will get, 9 times out of 10, you'll get everything you need by being open, non-judgmental, and just curious.
So I want to pivot that, because what I'm hoping that you all hear is that this is how Dave and folks here at Golden Gate, how we're training professionals who are working with those of you who are consumers or going to professionals. So what are you learning when you hear this? Let's take a pause for the cause for a minute. What are you all hearing about what you should be expecting from the people who serve you? Give me like two comments what are you hearing about if you were to choose to work with a financial planner? What are you expecting of them? You got one here and one here.
I'm curious as to what is the open-ended question you asked that lasted for an hour and a half.
So we've used a number of instruments over the years, including mind mapping and mind mapping George Kinder's 3 questions, which can be very powerful because it brings in a kinesthetic component. But what we have always done, whatever tools we might be using along the way, we've always started out by asking, tell us about you. And some people will tell us about them by starting out 4 generations back. And some of them will say, and when I graduated from college, the first thing they'll say is, and when I graduated from college, my first job was with IBM. And it's like, okay, well, I can see where your priorities lie. But we ask a question like that, tell us about you. And honestly, it's amazing how human beings will crack wide open given half a chance, just given an opening. I know that people often, when you haven't practiced with a lot of clients, people often think, oh no, I could never do that. There's an interesting cross-cultural thing. I've spoken to a lot of Japanese groups of financial planners, and I talk about some of this. I've been for 35 years. I've been talking to them about some of this life planning stuff, and they're like, "Oh no, we could never ask those questions. It would be too personal." And I think back to all of the experiences I've accumulated, having the retired Air Force colonel, Lockheed engineer sitting at my conference table, and you're thinking, yeah, you can't go anyplace airy-fairy with this guy. But you just ask the question, and he goes there. He goes there because you have a process. First of all, there's been some research around this for financial planners. Clients actually value you having a formal system or process for uncovering who and what matters to them and why. And if they sense that you have a process and that you're also showing up as an open, compassionate person, you're there for them, it doesn't matter what their background is, they will open up.
Yeah. I found the same thing. I specialize more in coaching, but the thing that I'm hoping you're picking up from that answer is that when we as professionals, as financial professionals, will make space for the client's humanity over their pocketbook, that's the difference. And so they might not, so as a coach, I would interrupt before they were an hour and a half in, and the point that I would still be leaning into with them is, what are the values that are present for you right now that bring you here, right? So what are we really talking about? Because I can guarantee you, people, how many of you in here think you have a financial goal? You have a financial goal. So whatever that goal is, I'd like for you to take one step back and think about the why. Anytime someone says, I want to make a lot of money, to Dr. Tom's point, there's something under that. The money means something. So even if we can state, I want to be able to buy a house, what's important about the house? I want to go back to school. What will going back to school do for you? I want to be able to send my kids to blah. What will you be teaching your kids? So every time we hear a goal, we hear a thing, we hear a product, we hear an item, we can use the practices that we're talking about to take one step back and really understand what is happening for the human being. What are they hoping to achieve? I have a client that it took us a year to get her budget together. I mean, literally a year, because every month it wasn't a regular month. That's not we can't count that month. It's not a regular month. And then one day we finally got it nailed down, and she got out of debt. She bought a home. She bought a new car. She wanted to have a child independently. She did that. And she called me about a year after the budget was in play and all of these goals had happened. And she called me, she says, now this is after a decade of having emergencies at Ann Taylor. Every time we would be working on the budget, she kept having emergencies in Ann Taylor. And so now the money's under control, everything's good. She's in Ann Taylor deliberately, right? And she says, they're going to give me 10% off if I apply for the credit card. So what do you think? Just shout out for me. What are three things you think could have been the driver about her wanting the credit card? 3 things, real quick.
Discounts. I was going to say she's proud of what she's learned, and she's now going, instead of I have to do this, is
strutting her stuff, right? She's confident now. Okay, I heard someone else.
discount.
That discount, right? The 10%, that was important to her. Whereas before, she was having emergencies in Ann Taylor all the time, whether she got the discount or not. One more, we got time for one. What else could she have been thinking? Acknowledgement. Now, so for some people, like I remember when my dad couldn't read or write, right? He was a construction worker. And I remember he had a credit card, I think it was an American Express. He looked at me, he said, you made it when you got one of these, right? And so we just never know. And if we live our own independent lives, and then what we do with the people that we love, whether our children, other family members, or whatever, if we are unexamined, we're now sharing whatever our belief is and maybe where it came from, or maybe or maybe we don't know, with other people without really examining, does it get us what we want? Does it get us what we want? And so my hope for all of you, whether you're a professional, we've got a lot of our students that are here, so that's why you'll notice that I continue to ask not only the impact, but how Dave trains folks for this kind of stuff. Because number one, he's one of the best. That's where I learned it from. And it's important for us to not only understand it from being the professional, but engaging with the professional. You all get to choose a professional who connects with you where you are. Where you are. Not just about what you have or what you're trying to accomplish. So whether you're on the professional side and you're doing the work for someone, or you're seeking someone to do the work with you, you get to own your power around having a professional that works with you around your values. I think we had one more. This gentleman, I think, wanted to add something. Thank you. And Andrea, please let me know if we have comments or questions that we should take from Zoom.
We do have
What I was curious about.
A little bit closer for me there.
What I was curious about finding out is how the clients themselves have changed their thought process and their thinking when it comes to money as they get older. Like questions like, what have you learned when it comes to the philosophy and how you think about money at 40 compared to what it was when you were 14?
Right. Okay, so I'm gonna shape that a little bit and ask each of them to answer, right? Because it leads to, I promise he's not a plant. I didn't ask him to ask that question. What the next question I wanted to bring to you all is the notion of both positive and perceived negative emotions. When we think about shame and money, or I think, Tom, you alluded to it earlier about the meaning that we give money when it comes from external. So if you, and tell me if I'm not making sense, because what's in my head is, how does strong emotions or fears or shame impact what people choose or believe about themselves? Most of my work as a coach is about exploring limiting beliefs. So if somebody is behaving in a way that indicates to me that they believe there will never be enough, there'll never be enough, I invite them to explore whose story is that, and is it true? So when you all think about shame, when you think about money fears, things that either drive people or cause them to pull back, what are some of the things that you would offer, both on the human side and then on the professionals navigating the human side? Ready?
Yeah, either way.
I always like for you to go first, because I really want to hear the perspective of the psychology, and then Dave drop that money on it.
Sure, I'll give it a shot.
And then I'll drop some money on it.
Yeah, please. You know, I've been thinking as we've been talking, there is a sense in which I think today we're saying everything is about money, or everything is touched by money. And there's also a sense in which nothing is about money. And you know what I mean by that is that there's always something deeper. And I think that your question, gets to that. I was also thinking about your example of the Ann Taylor and the credit card, and I have no idea about what was going on for that particular person. But I do want to also add in a little bit of it feels kind of like a darker thing to say, but I think it's an important truth, which is that when people get better, they're leaving behind old identities. And there's often a lot of internal conflict about that, right? I mean, that's why you often see people as they get better, then they do something to undermine their progress, because there's something about that new identity that evokes shame or guilt, right? And I want to make a distinction between shame and guilt. I think those are two really important emotions that are often at play here. I think of guilt as a bad feeling about what you've done. I've done something that hurt another person or contradicts my values in some way, whereas shame is a bad feeling about who you are, right? It's more global. And the thing about shame is also that it loops. You feel ashamed about, say, financial success, and then you feel ashamed of being ashamed. And so it has this way of getting kind of more and more internally intense. Both guilt and shame usually reflect some inherited emotional script, right? Could be that you grew up in a family where there was deprivation and poverty, and by achieving financial success, you feel like you're leaving your family behind, or you're leaving your tribe behind, right? You're becoming one of them, those people that always looked down on me when I was a child, right? Or it could be that, getting yourself that thing at Ann Taylor, it feels like, what about all the people that can't do that? I feel guilty in relation to them. So as soon as you're in guilt and shame, you're in the realm of the social, and you're right back in your family of origin. All those internalized scripts and images and messages, they come alive for you. I think for both guilt and shame, what's the path out of that? It's almost always relationship, right? I think that when you can bring those feelings into a relationship with a financial planner, with a therapist, and hold them in that relationship, then they can start to detoxify.
Thank you. I felt that. Did y'all feel that? Yeah, where did y'all feel it? I felt it right about here. Y'all point to where did you feel it? Yeah, yeah. Okay. Dave, drop some money on it.
Well, so so the thing about being a financial planner, I mean, not that people don't have goals when they come to see a psychotherapist, but I think their goals are often to feel better. And it's very often the case that when someone comes to a financial planner, it's to deal with change of a different sort, a more material change. They lost a job, they gained a job. They had an inheritance. They, something happened, or they have a goal. They want to accumulate enough money to educate their kids, or to retire in comfort, or to take care of aging parents. I mean, they have some kind of material goal that they're struggling with. They're struggling to achieve, and it's because they have limiting beliefs. They don't. It's very easy for us to think about the times when something didn't work out, and so I always think of the work of the late, great Ed Jacobson and this concept called appreciative inquiry. I think appreciative inquiry is one of the most powerful tools that a financial planner can bring to this process with their clients. It's very easy, and it's very natural to ask someone, well, why have you always failed at that? Why did that never work? Why did you fail every time you try and achieve that goal that you're asking me to now help you with? Instead, with appreciative inquiry, you try and open up more of a possibility mindset. You say, tell me about a time when you set a goal and achieved it. It does not have to be a financial goal by any stretch. They might tell you about the time when they really wanted to lose 20 pounds and they achieved it. And so you ask them to tell you more about that. And what it does is it opens up this belief, oh, I have set a goal before. I have achieved that goal. I have within me that possibility. And now they're open to hearing maybe some practical strategies you might offer them for how to move towards the current goal that you're exploring with them. And so, shame is such a powerful thing. I had a client who was sent to me by a mediator. She was going through a divorce mediation as part of the process. And she had to build a budget. She had to build a budget for the process to move forward. And she was struggling with that. And at some point I said, look, I understand the struggle. Just give us the last 3 months, credit card statements, bank statements, whatever. And my team will analyze them and we'll build your budget for you. She burst into tears. And it turned out that she was ashamed of the fact, maybe she was feeling guilty about it. Maybe I'm not going to use the term of art correctly, I'm sure. But she was feeling some amount of shame about the fact that we would see all of these overdraft charges on her bank statement. And I had to just sit back quietly and sit with her and just say, this is a judgment-free zone. That is not who you are. That's just your stuff. Let us help you analyze your stuff. We're not analyzing you. This is not your identity. We're just going to look at your stuff. And so the degree of emotionality that can come out when money is involved is because people have been taught to attach a lot of importance to money. And so always looking for that possibility mindset. Again, I'm going to bring it back to Ed Jacobson and appreciative inquiry. You know, looking for ways to open up that possibility mindset. And it could be as simple as, tell me the last time you set a goal and you achieved it.
There's a book called The Little Book of Appreciative Inquiry, and it's called that because it's a little book. And it is a lovely way to do what I call grow the good, right? It starts with, rather than what's wrong here, it starts with what's good here. And then you focus on growing what is already working. So for in your financial life, whether it feels to you like it's something in your psychology, your mindset about money, or the reality, for some people, they've done all the right stuff and are still in financial distress. So irrespective of what the situation is, right? No matter what's happening, even if you have made mistakes or you're working with clients who have made mistakes, one of the things that you can look at is, what here are you most proud of? What have you done that you really feel like you nailed it? And for some, it might just be, I opened my bills on time. That, for the longest time, I just never wanted to pay your Uncle Sam. So I would file an extension every year. I never wanted to pay, I've been self-employed for a long time, never wanted to pay your Uncle Sam. I finally got to the point where I made the mental shift of the stress that it was causing me. I was doing what was legal. I could kick it out to October 15th, and so it was okay to do it. But it was causing me so much mental distress to do it that an achievement for me was doing it on April 15th, no matter what. Right? And so different people are going to have different levels of achievement. And I think what I want to do, Dave, is ask you to elaborate. You kind of are going there, and I want to bring in this gentleman's comment earlier about the financial life cycle, right? That some of the things that when we're younger, I know for me, 40 was a big deal, and that's what made me a career changer, right? I knew I wasn't going to have enough. So talk a little bit about the financial life cycle. And what are some of the things that you see that allow people or provide an opportunity for people to start seeing their money behaviors or mindsets differently between like 20s into 60s? I'll stop there.
I can already think of like 5 different lenses through which to look at that, but I will say I talk about financial planners as being as dealing with change. And clients almost invariably come to us because of environmental change, the things I listed before, lost a job, gained a job, received an inheritance, whatever. Some external change has suddenly entered their life and they need to figure out how to cope with it. Or volitional change, kind of like when you go on a diet. I want to save up enough money to achieve this goal or that. I want to buy a new car. And then, as you say, there's life cycle change. It's like, all right, your first job out of college, that's a major life cycle transition. When you find yourself in a committed relationship, if you start to have kids, acquire your first house or your second house. These things are changes that, in some version or another, everyone goes through. They could be planned for it sometimes more easily because they do tend to follow a cycle. Most people retire in their late 50s to late 60s. Okay, well, if you're in your 20s, you can actually plan for it. Not very many 20-year-olds do, but they can be encouraged to if you show them how powerful it can be. And I think that's one of the things with life cycle changes is that they're more easily anticipated in some version. Everyone is going to be unique, and they can become kind of a baseline part of the planning. But related to that, this other lens is the policy-based financial planning. And policies are just simple decision rules that can be applied, ideally, if they're well crafted, can be applied to any situation and create a unique answer. And you can have saving policies and the risk management policies with respect to how you use or don't use insurance, for example. You can have estate planning policies, legacy policies. And people, the thing that we like about the policies is we can give a young person graduating from college, we can help them develop some policies about risk management and savings.
And clarify what you mean by risk management.
Risk management meaning, well, risk management takes a lot of different forms. I mean, risk is this notion that more things can happen than will happen. And except within a broad range, we don't really know what will happen. We can have a notion of the range of things that might happen, and so since some of those things that can happen are often bad outcomes, risk management is about planning for that. And it could be planning for good health by diet and exercise and things like that. And it could be for planning for a long life not being bad news because you actually accumulated enough savings that you can retire someday. And it can mean, especially a younger person, it could mean that you could get hurt, or if you have family responsibilities, you could die prematurely. And if there are people who are dependent on you, that dependency doesn't change. And so preparing for that, whether it means having an emergency fund or acquiring the right types and amounts of insurance.
And Dave, that's what I really wanted you to get to, so that people can hear that throughout our lives, right? Those are the things that we all want to make sure that we're thinking about. And there's the psychological aspect of it. I hear often that elders don't want to have the conversation around money because they think as soon as they do their will, they'll die, right? And I've actually heard people say that. And so when you think about helping folks to think about this kind of stuff, how do you navigate that emotional aspects of it, along with knowing, because people are coming to you because you're the expert, you have something that they don't know, and there's still the emotional attachment.
Well, and the most important things they do know, they just sometimes don't know that they know. And so that is the first thing that, one of the things that is a theme that threads throughout our capstone cases course is knowing how to uncover who and what matters to a client and why. So here's the thing, if invited to under the right circumstances, they can identify all the most important people in their lives. And they can identify the things that matter to them and why they matter, which is to say values, right? Values are a big why behind what drives us to make decisions on a day-to-day basis. Who and what matters to them and why. They don't always know that they have the answers to those questions, but if you create the space for it and you take the time, financial planning done well is a very time-consuming process. There's no way around it. You can uncover that, and then once you've uncovered it, first of all, that becomes like a light bulb for them. Once they have more clarity, but it's clarity about something they already knew. You just helped uncover it. And then it means you can frame your financial planning advice around that. Because, again, there's a lot of research here, but it has such face validity that I probably don't even need to tell you that. If you just say to someone, well, I really think you should have a revocable living trust because it will streamline the settlement of your estate and provide some advantages to, you can give all the technical reasons. Yeah, no way. They won't hear you and they won't act on it. But if you instead say, well, those things that you said you really wanted to assure that you could accomplish for your granddaughter Lou, you wanted to help her do this and you wanted to help her do that. Having this revocable living trust can be a tool that can help you achieve those things. Now all of a sudden they're hearing you. You just found the channel into their interest and their understanding, and the channel was through their granddaughter. And you knew that would be the case because you spent the time to uncover who and what matters to them and why.
Thank you. So this brings us to our last question. We've got some questions on Zoom that I want to get to. I know there's questions in the room that I want to get to. So I'm going to tell y'all a story. You two are going to unpack it from your disciplines. Okay, ready? Ready? I mentioned that I was unhoused at 15. I say 15, it was more like pushing 16, right? I was almost 16. And after being an amazing student, headed for college, when I became unhoused, I dropped out of high school, took my GED, and joined the Navy at 17 years old, right? Fast forward do my military service, go back to college, become a financial planner, learn all the things about money, can look at mistakes without shame anymore. All of that's fantastic. My son and my 3 grandchildren, that's important, my 3 grandchildren have to move out of the home that they're renting. My granddaughter was turning the age I was when I became unhoused. I went and bought a house. I gutted my retirement with a master's degree in financial planning. I gutted my retirement, ticked off my partner, who, great partner, right? Knows way more about money than me, smarter about money than me, does better stuff with money than me, and I bought a house. I would love to say it was a wonderful opportunity for an investment in real estate that I believe was going to offer great returns in the future. I would love to be able to say that. I will say to Dr. Tom, didn't even think about it. My granddaughter was turning 16. I was not going to let them be put out of their, I mean, granted, they were looking for another place. They had money to pay the rent. And I blew up my life and bought a house. What do you have to say to me?
You sound like a very caring and loving grandmother. That's what I have to say. You know, I think you already analyzed it. I mean, in the story, you know, if a patient came to me and told me that story, I think the thing I would say is, you know, I think you've already provided your own analysis, which is that, you know, you looked at your granddaughter, you saw what she was going through, you have a kind of identification with her, right? I mean, I think when we look at younger people, our children, our grandchildren, you know, it can depend on, say, gender match or appearance or personality, but it's very common for us to feel a strong identification with them. We see them and it evokes in us our own plight at that age. Often, you know, in the body, in our feelings, unconsciously. It may not be something, you know, that we're sort of stepping back and analyzing, but we feel it. We feel that identification. And because we feel that identification, their plight, you know, it grips us in the most powerful way. Right? And if I were to say, you know, one thing, a kind of takeaway message for me is that the things you can't examine, the things you can't think about, things you can't reflect on, those are the things we act out, right? Because the emotion has to go somewhere.
Say that again, Doc. Say that again.
Yeah, I mean, this is, you know, a 150-year-old idea starting like back with Freud, right? The things we can't reflect on, we act out. If there's an emotion, a kind of relationship, you know, experience that's being revived for us, anything that's happening in our emotional world, if we can't put it into words and communicate it to ourselves or to another person, it's going to get discharged in our behavior. It has to go somewhere. And, you know, that's not necessarily a problem, but sometimes it can lead to things like, you know, impulsivity.
Thank you so much. Dave.
I probably have 3 things to say. The first thing I want to say is your story is one of tremendous resilience. I think that young, almost 16-year-old who had to deal with an incredibly traumatic experience and did so by saying, okay, I'm going to get my GED, I'm going to join the Navy, I'm going to move forward, I'm going to manage my life. To me, that's a display of tremendous resilience. So you almost painted it as a failure or a bad decision. I'm not so sure.
Thank you. Thank you for that reframe. That is appreciative inquiry.
Yeah, and the second thing I would say is that financial planning, you know, this is something that financial planners, if they're going to be good, they have to recognize, and that is that financial planning is not about optimizing. It's not about optimizing along some technical dimension. First of all, if you're going to do that, why would you ever retire? That's not financially optimal. You should be acquiring money until the day you die and investing it intelligently. Financial planning is about helping people achieve as big a life as they can given the resources and given their priorities, given the who and what matters to them and why. And you did something because of an experience you feared your granddaughter was going to have, and you wanted to forestall that, you wanted to prevent it, you wanted to redirect it send it in a new direction. And was that financially optimal for you? No. But would I, as your financial planner, would I say every decision has to be financially optimal for you? Also no. And so what's my role as a financial planner? I know I keep bringing it back to that. And it is to say, you did what you did for reasons that we both understand. It was important to you. It was your highest priority. Now let's manage it. Now let's manage it, because now I'm going to invite you to show some more resilience and manage the consequences of that decision.
Thank you. All right, so first let's hear it for them before we go to questions. Let's hear it. So I'm sure that by now you all know why I asked these two gentlemen to be my panelists for this conversation. The first thing that I'd like to do, I know there are questions here, but if you would give a little bit of grace, we've got some questions on Zoom that I'd like to take, and then we'll get to the ones in the room. Yes?
Thank you, Sandra. We have one comment from Robert Wyatt and one question from Carmen E.
Okay.
The first comment from Robert: wonderful, enlightening discussion. I was fortunate to earn an undergraduate degree in psychology and MBA and PhD in business from Golden Gate University. I only wish the study of behavioral economics was more widely recognized.
Well, thank you.
The question that we have from Carmen E. In psychotherapy, cultural competency is an essential construct. Can you comment on your experience with lack mentality across different cultures?
Yeah, so I will take a run out of that, and then you two add whatever you'd like to add. I specifically chose the pathway that I chose as in financial coaching because when I came into this profession, more often than not, financial planners were not working with people who were low and moderate income. They were working primarily as wealth managers and working with folks who had wealth to manage. And most of the people that I wanted to serve did not have that. And so I do think culture doesn't always mean poverty. So I think that I'll invite them to share what they share about that. But from my perspective, what I noticed was making assumptions about who people are was really detrimental to their experience in financial education, counseling, coaching, planning, and yes, even therapy. And that might look like if I'm a financial planner or a financial professional that is only trying to optimize their financial situation, and I see there's a 10% gap on that budget, right? And I happen to notice that that 10% gap is going to their church. And saying something like, if you stopped tithing to the church, you could bridge this financial gap, right? I would be guilty, if you will, of ignoring something that may be very culturally important to them. And quite frankly, many people believe that their tithing or their commitment to their spiritual practice is why they have what they have. So I could be flying in the face of exactly what is most important to them in the desire to optimize their financial situation. So I am not a believer that cultural competency is a real thing. I think that cultural humility is more appropriate, and that people who are working with folks, and I think it's also not safe to assume that if you're from the same culture, that you are an expert in understanding what someone else believes. So I think sometimes we kind of put it all together that, certain people only want to be served by the people who look like them or believe like them or practice like them. I don't know that that's true. I think that people want to be served by someone who can see them, and if they can see them without the lens of, I know what you look like, so I know who you are, or I know what you believe, so I know who you are. So for me, that's where the cultural humility comes in, being willing to not know. So as a coach, I seek to ask the question that only the client knows the answer to. And so if I'm going to ask someone a question, that's what I'm going to ask them, something that I don't have a presupposition or a predetermined perspective about. What do you two want to add?
Yeah, well, I think, you covered a lot of it. If we look at the learning objectives for the psychology degree, we talk about cultural humility, not cultural competency, because I think there is this unfortunate trend in psychology to teach cultural competency, Today's class is going to be about this ethnic group, next class about this ethnic group. And so you give these kind of prefabricated categories that you then slot people into. And whether that turns out to be right or wrong for a given individual, it's not a part of the therapeutic process. The therapeutic process is much more oriented around what does your culture mean to you? What meaning have you made of it, and how does it now shape your experience of the world? What ghosts does it carry for you? What resources does it bring to bear for you? How does it shape the experience that you're having today? And so I would go into it, I think humility is a good word, curiosity is another one. I would go into it with those attitudes and try to assume as little as possible. Now, if I know certain things about a culture, for example, if I know that a given patient has, their parents immigrated under, conditions of hardship, that's certainly in my mind and it might shape my curiosity, but I wouldn't assume that it has a particular meaning for the patient. I'd be curious about what it means for them.
Thank you. And there's actually an excellent book called Curiosity, with the question mark. Okay.
And I love the way you put that. It would shape your curiosity.
Yes.
That's such a wide open way of putting it and a wide open approach. I guess the only thing I would add is that I think it's tremendously important. Shortly after CFP Board declared the psychology of financial planning as the newest knowledge domain, I was invited to co-edit a text on the title, The Psychology of Financial Planning. Director Davis was one of our contributors. I mean, my role as editor was twofold. One was to help recruit contributors. We got some great psychologists and full-time academics from around the country to contribute chapters. And a number of them look at this issue of cultural awareness. I like that, more sort of an open phrase, from the standpoint of awareness, of knowing that people are going to come from different cultural backgrounds, which ideally will shape your curiosity in the way you approach it, not because you're going to mold them, not because you're going to put a value judgment on them, but because you're going to seek to understand where they're coming from, because again, you can better advise them if you understand their background. You can better advise them because you understand where they're coming from and because you can deliver advice, again, in a way they can hear it. And this is just one more area where you sort of have to get your reps. You've got to go out there and do some reading and do some study and do some workshops and take some classes in order to broaden your awareness of the range of human experience and how it can influence them, so that, I guess, again, so you can approach it with more humility.
Thank you. All right. Yeah. So they'll bring the mic to you, and we've got a question here. Well, Fula, why don't we start here and then work our way around?
So just a comment and then a question. It was about the comment about the shame topic. And, my comment is, just as a financial planner, one question that I like to ask is, if you were to hire a cleaner to come clean your house, would you clean the house first before they arrived?
Yes, so that's a yes for me.
Yes.
Yeah. and usually they chuckle at that and they say, well, no, probably not. And I said, well, that's the same thing, if you're coming to me, there's
up off the floor.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Maybe shame a little
Things,
bit.
right?
But no, I think that helps, get the point across, as far as you shouldn't feel shame because you're coming to me. This is what I do, so. But my question is, so I find that a lot of clients, those that have money tend to worry about it, and those that don't really have anything worry not at all. And so specifically, I have clients that, and I'm thinking of one in particular, a quick story, $9 million of assets, been savers their whole entire working lives, very penny pinchers, and then they're now in their 80s. And this happened recently, and I sat down, did a review with them, and the wife had to get double knee surgery. She had a walker, and it had the tennis balls on it. Well, their house, I'm in Florida, their house in Florida is fully carpeted, even the bathroom, I know. And so he told me the story about how wife came home and she couldn't maneuver around with the tennis balls on her walker. And I said to him, I said, well, what if you just change out carpets, put down hardwood? I'm sure she'd appreciate that. And he said to me, well, it's not an emergency. And I said to him, no, it is an emergency. You know, you told me over all these years that if there's ever an emergency, tell me that I need to spend my money. And I'm telling you now, it's an emergency, spend your money. It just was so hard for him to do that. It was just like gut-wrenching. So my question is, what do you say to those people, in your experience, that have a difficult time spending down their assets?
I mean, we've often used policies for doing that, where we develop a spending policy. And if there's a decision rule that says, well, that based on some combination of the level of assets you have at any on December 31 of each year, and the rate of return you earned and the inflation rate. I mean, we could have all kinds of like objective inputs. People actually like that in the right setting. And then this policy tells you how much you can safely spend. And then you connect it to what matters to them. Like, how many times you're going to be able to make your wife's life this much more comfortable sliding tennis balls across hardwood instead of dragging them on carpet. I find that oftentimes if there's kind of a decision rule in place and the client participated in crafting it, so it feels like they own it, they can get through that. The sort of like universal hesitation. And I know that Sandra has done a lot of work with policies, and she's done brilliant work in terms of a process that pulls the clients in. So they feel like, oh, I crafted this policy, I own this policy. My financial planner is telling me this policy is not inconsistent with my finances, and because I participated, I can see how it also reflects what my priorities are, what matters to me. I think that might be the first approach I would take.
Yeah. The thing I would add is that often we think we know what's best for them without hearing from them about what they think is best. So what I would be curious about, what would shape my curiosity of that client would be, what lifestyle changes feel necessary now? That's what I would want to know. And so I really follow my own curiosity rather than try to convince. I don't believe we convince anyone of anything. I believe that what we can do is invite them to explore what they believe, if it's true, and if they want it to be true. Because just because something's true doesn't mean it has to be true. And so I live in that place of the appreciative inquiry. Dr. T, what do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I can chime in, although I just want to clarify my role is very different. So it would never be my place to kind of take a position about what a person should or shouldn't do just because I'm in the therapist role, not the financial planner role. But I think there are two general therapeutic principles that might apply. And one is to make the unconscious conscious, right? And it seems like you did that. Your wife is pushing around this walker on tennis balls. She can't move, shine the light of his attention on that fact and the suffering that it's causing him. He may have been in a place of, defense or constriction and hadn't really even allowed himself to appreciate the burden that was placing upon his wife, right? So just taking time to kind of soak that in and recognize it, emotionally recognize it, not just intellectually. And then I think the second principle, which might sound a little strange, to this audience, but it's basically to turn denial into conflict. And what do I mean by that? Instead of saying to yourself, oh, no, it's not an emergency, I'm not going to spend that money. That's denial, right? Turn it into a conflict. And what's the conflict? The conflict is between his wish to save his money and his wish to spare his wife suffering, right? There's an actual conflict there. He wants to hoard his resources, but he also loves this woman and doesn't want her to be in pain. That's a genuine emotional conflict. And so I'd want to actually develop that. You have competing priorities. Let's look at those. And I wouldn't take a position on either side just because of my role, but I feel that if a person can think about that conflict, they're in a much better position to make a conscious choice.
Thank you for that. It was very helpful. And I will say, I do think financial planners are putting their relationship in danger when they should on a client. And that's what's different between coaching and some other interventions. I do know that there are some right answers in financial planning. I get that. I've studied it enough to know that there are some right answers. And I believe now, having dealt with as many humans as I have in my 65 years, that I don't should on myself or anybody else at this point. If someone believes what they believe, what I do is invite them to look at the difference between, I do not say wants versus needs. I don't use the word versus at all. I'll say living expenses, what does it cost you to operate your home? And lifestyle expenses, what will make your life better? And so that's how we bridge that gap between, is it an emergency? Is it necessary? And so I do that with language that is non-judgmental and allows the client to then decide for themselves. Okay, y'all, we're running out of time. We've got 2 other questions, so we want to get to those. And then our panelists will have a final word and we will conclude.
Hi, thank you this is wonderful and very good for getting the brain going. I'm just going to say, you can also point out, well, okay, you don't want to do the carpet and all of that, but, you know, kind of go along the lines of, well, if she falls down, do you have the strength to help her up?
Oh my.
And,
Okay, let's go ahead and get to our question.
All right. Yeah. So for me, I'm in a slightly different area, but I'm very curious to overcoming like one's own bias in talking about, and basically that touches on the whole culture thing or how you believe one should spend money or not. And a lot of the biases, well, they may not even be apparent in your own brain. They may be subconscious or unconscious. And then there's also the role of the, you know, advisor or whatever that's maybe ignoring the bias that they don't necessarily know about. So I'm just wondering about how to figure out to address that.
Got it. Okay. Tom, would you take this one first and then Dave add? We literally have 5 minutes, y'all.
Yeah. There's no overcoming bias completely, but I think to the degree that it can be done, it's from taking up that position of curiosity, right? To the greater degree that you can regard another person as their own subjectivity, their own sort of center of experience that's distinct from yours, and try to learn about that and to step into that position to the greatest ability that you can. To my mind, that's how you overcome bias, just to be very brief.
Yeah, no, and I mean, that's a brilliant answer, and I couldn't agree more. And maybe there's a last little piece I would put, and it's not a term of art, and it probably would make Tom cringe, but it's like my position has always been to advise people well, you kind of have to love them. And if you can't love your client, oh, for God's sake, let them find someone who will.
Yes.
Let them find a financial planner who will love them. I can't advise every person on the face of the earth. I could actually name people that I could not advise. It doesn't mean I don't want them to get good advice. It just can't be with me.
And Dave, I think that's an important piece, whether you're a provider or you're a client. Ed Jacobson said, and this is what he taught me a lot of things, but this is one thing. If you cannot hold your client in perfect positive regard, you have not earned the right to work with them. And I believe that that is true. It's okay. I believe that that is true. Our clients deserve to be held in the highest esteem in our eyes. And if we cannot, I don't believe we deserve the right to work with them. All right, we've got one more question.
My question is,
hold the mic a little closer.
My question is mainly towards Tom. How do you help out patients that have a mindset of, Mom, Dad, I love you, but my view of financial success is different than yours, and I don't want to create conflict because our financial success philosophies differ?
Thank you. Tom?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and it's a deep one, right? I mean, it touches on this question of what's called separation and individuation. You know, as you move away from your family of origin, you establish your own identity, your own values that may be in conflict with, you know, your primary caretakers. And for a lot of people, that brings up a lot of stuff. Feelings of, you know, betrayal and disloyalty, shame, you know, can be a big part of it. And so it's really the same answer. How do you hold that all up to the light of awareness, develop the ability to think about it, surface where the conflicts lie? And the reality is often there's no solution that doesn't bring discomfort or even pain, right? I mean, it may be that in establishing your own identity, if that's what you choose to do, you do come into conflict with certain, you know, loyalties that you grew up with, and that's a painful process. I think it's much more about helping a person to articulate it all as clearly as they can so that they can then make a conscious choice.
Thank you. Dave, anything you want to add?
No, that was great.
So there's one, can I add something as a grandma? Okay, so I had to learn that my fears were getting in the way of thinking that I knew what was best for my son and my grandchildren. And until I was able, in internal family systems, which is my new hot button right now, is what's called a U-turn. And when something is activating or causes that in me, rather than look at the thing or even the person, I'm doing the U-turn to look back at what is that. And so, you know, Tom, I'm going to use that to shape my curiosity. And sometimes that's very difficult for parents and even grandparents. But it's something that I'm learning how to do, and recognizing that it's my own narcissism, if you were going to use the word that everybody loves right now, that thinks I know what's best for another human being, even if that human being came from my body. Them coming from my body does not make me an expert in their lives. Yes?
Can I ask you a follow-up question on that?
You can.
Just really.
Yeah, you're pushing me. You're pushing, but it's okay. Go ahead. Hit me.
I'm sorry. How degree in the financial planner would you be involved in that type of like the wealth is generational, and then we're just I'm a financial planner too, and then when it comes to like the topic of like grandkids or their son, daughter, just how degree and in what position as a financial planner would you be involved and into that kind of conversation?
So I would like for this to be, I asked you all for your closing comments. This feels like a really good way to shape. You can say whatever else you want, but let's take this on home. How would you navigate a client of yours, whether it's financial or therapeutic, and their relationship with the next generations? What suggestions or thoughts do you have about that?
You know, I think at the end of the day, in terms of the relationship, you know, it's not my role to give them advice about how to craft their relationship. But in terms of the consequences of some decisions that relationship might give rise to, like buying a house because you're worried about one of your grandchildren. My role there, I think, is to just surface all of the related consequences. I'm not here to tell you what to do, but to the degree there are financial consequences, I have an obligation to make sure that you understand the full scope of those consequences and thus make as informed a decision as you can. And they might say, I want to give this money to my grandchild so they can, whatever, start a business, buy a house, whatever it is they want to do. And I'm okay if I can't retire until I'm 85. Okay. I've done my job, I think, if I've made sure that you're aware that you'll be working till 85 if you do this, go down this path. And I definitely don't think my job is to say, do not do this. You must retire at 65. No, work to 85. And you know what? If you die sooner, you're not going to know the difference, right?
Tom, bring us home.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. So I guess I'd make 2 points. One is that money has meaning. Money has more than one meaning for each of us, right? It's overdetermined in the sense that many different meanings attached to it. And we'll learn about those meanings to the degree that we're curious, right? So curiosity is what unfolds meaning. And I think that applies to money. It applies to everything, in my point of view. And then the other thing I think I'd say, very much related to your point, is when you feel that internal impulse to impose your values on another person, that's when you need to do that U-turn thing. You need to get curious about what is getting kicked up in me such that I want to make this person like me. And I think the much more important thing, if we're working therapeutically, is can you bring curiosity to that impulse in yourself? That'll unfold much more than trying to exact some kind of compliance in the other person. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all. With that, we will close. I do want to ask, do we send a survey out at the end of this? Do we send a survey to the folks who have joined us? Can we send a survey?
Yes, we can.
Yes, so we will be sending a survey out to those of you in Zoom land and in the room. And as Dr. Dave mentioned, I do have a favorite money style assessment that you can do. And for people who return the survey, people who do the survey before October 10th, we will send you the link that you can do the self-assessment. It's a very fun game. You will enjoy it. And for folks who send us the survey back, you will get that from me and stay in touch with us. Thank you for being here. Folks in Zoom land, thank you for being with us. And we look forward to hearing your thoughts on conversations like this that you would like to hear more of. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you to Doctors Dave and Tom, and to all of you.